Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final offering in this year's Dr. Bruce J. Nelson Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Groves, Dean of the Faculty at Harvey Mudd and Professor of Literature. Our Nelson Speaker Series theme this year is water. And this fall, we've been exploring water with the help of speakers who are at the forefront of water science, policy, and technology. We're pleased to continue this relevant and timely conversation with tonight's panel of scientists and entrepreneurs who will speak directly to the challenges our world faces when it comes to access to clean water. Before we introduce the panelists, I'd like to first recognize that the Nelson Speaker Series is made possible through the generosity of the family of the late Bruce J. Nelson, class of 1974. Bruce had a tremendous impact on the many people whose lives he touched. On behalf of the college and the community, I'd like to thank the Nelson family for creating such a tremendous series to honor Bruce's memory. I also want to offer thanks to the Nelson Series faculty committee members for their help in planning this year's series and bringing tonight's speaker to campus: Peter Saida, Marianne Dillette, Patrick Little, and Tanja Srebotnjak. At this point, I'd like to invite tonight's moderator, Tanja Srebotnjak, to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'd also like to thank you for coming tonight. It's our last series event in the series, and I hope you'll all go home having learned something new and with some stimulating thoughts to ponder over. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. We have here to my left Charles Matlack, who is actually an alumnus of Harvey Mudd, and he's the CEO of PotaVida, a company founded with the goal of providing safe water with certainty. Charles received his BS in engineering from Harvey Mudd College and a master's and PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Washington. Over here on my far left is Abraham Flaxman. AB is an assistant professor of global health at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he's currently leading the development of new methods for measuring the efficiency of health facilities and is engaged in methodological and operational research on verbal autopsy. Dr. Flaxman was a postgraduate fellow at IHME, and before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Microsoft Research. Originally from Evanston, Illinois, Dr. Flaxman earned his BS in mathematics from MIT, and he earned his PhD in algorithms, combinatorics, and optimization from Carnegie Mellon. And then in the middle, we have Hemi Thaker, who is also the parent of a current student here at Harvey Mudd. Hemi is a true entrepreneur, a serial starter of successful companies. He co-founded 4, in fact, and he is a recipient of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award for Central Texas in 2011. He also holds 17 patents. Hemi is the co-founder of Waterloo Springs, a nonprofit dedicated to creating self-sustaining ecosystems to continually better the lives of those in need using frugal engineering and design thinking. So let's give a first round of applause to our speakers. Tonight's format is a roundtable conversation. So I've prepared some questions for our speakers, but I will leave about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Before we get started, I'd like to set the stage by citing a few key statistics from the 2015 Millennium Development Goal Report published by the United Nations. And then our speakers will each introduce themselves a bit more and highlight the work that they are currently engaged in. So, water is our theme for this series. In 2015, 91% of the global population is using an improved drinking water source, compared with 76% in 1990. Of the 2.6 billion people who have gained access to improved drinking water since 1990, 1.9 billion gained access to piped drinking water. Globally,
147 countries have met the Millennium Development Goal for drinking water, 95 countries have met the sanitation target, and 77 countries have met both. Worldwide, 2.1 billion people have gained access to improved sanitation. The proportion of urban population living in slums in the developing regions fell from around 40% in 2000 to 30% in 2014. However, all is not as rosy as it may seem. There are still continued threats to the livelihood and health of millions of people worldwide. For example, the most vulnerable populations remain at high risk, gender inequality persists, and income inequality is on the rise. In addition, climate change threatens to undermine those recent gains, and violent conflict remains the biggest threat to human development. The WHO estimates that water, sanitation, hygiene was responsible for 842,000 deaths from diarrheal disease in 2012, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The WHO also says that many other diseases could be prevented by providing adequate water quality and quantity, sanitation facilities, and training in hygiene behavior. So I hope that these statistics provide a great framework for our conversation. I'd now like to ask Avi to introduce himself and his work.
Thanks so much, Tanja. Should I do it sitting down? I think I'm going to try to play with the computer, so it'll be better if I'm sitting down. I am a mathematician by training, and everything I know about global health I really learned on the job. And I learned it on the job when I landed in the middle of this giant study called the Global Burden of Disease study. It's now become kind of a franchise, so that was the Global Burden of Disease 2010. And in the Global Burden of Disease 2010, we were going to make comparable estimates of all diseases everywhere in the world over time for different ages, for different sexes. And when I would tell my buddies from the math department about what I was up to, if they were really engaged with it, the question they would ask is, what are the units? You know, how do you actually quantify disease burden? What measurement is that you're making? And the answer, at least at IHME, the way we were doing it, is in years. We measure burden in life years that are removed by the disease, disability-adjusted life years that combine years live with disability and years lost, of life lost. And when we put it all together, and I'm trying to put this into a 5-minute or less intro, this is what we find. This is the thing that people were looking at this whole time and saying, is the whole talk going to be as much of a downer as this thing is? But it was an epic amount of work to put together all these little squares. And what this is a tree map. It's basically a glorified pie chart where each little wedge of this giant rectangle represents the amount of disease, the amount of burden attributable to each of these diseases. And I put it up here in part because I want to invite you to play around with it yourselves. It's got a tiny little URL, so don't even try to read that. Just do a web search to find GBD, Global Burden of Disease, compare. And that'll take you to this. And what you will find here is a lot of interesting things hidden away, including something about water. So if you go from cause display to risk display, then it will shade in each of those wedges of the glorified pie by how much of that burden we can say is due to something. And the something it starts with is all risk factors. But if I change that to be unsafe water, sanitation, and hand washing, then it will shade in just the burden of disease that we think is due to water. And you see a huge fraction of the diarrhea burden due to unsafe water, and also a huge fraction of intestinal infections. And that's not everything, but that's everything that we are able to say really conclusively. If you were able to improve water, these are the parts of the pie that would go away. And these things we should note do not affect people of all ages equally. If I shift this map to show just the under 5-year-old burden, then you see a huge increase in the importance of safe water. I'll show you one more thing that you can play around with yourself with this, because this is a global view. It masks a huge amount of heterogeneity, so it is not at all equal where this burden falls. And in places like the United States, we are very much on the low end of the burden, say, of diarrhea. And if I slide this and say, you know, let's just look at places where, I guess percent is a nicer way to do it, where we're talking about, say, 4% of the population of the burden is coming from diarrhea, then we see that there is, you know, really clear concentration in Africa and in South and Southeast Asia where this is a problem. And I'll show you one more thing and then turn it over. But as Tanja mentioned in the introduction, there actually has been huge progress over the last 20 years. So rewinding this to 1990, you can now see large parts of Central and South America also in this high burden area, as well as East Asia. And as I advance through time, you can see the burden shrinking and those certain parts of the map kind of lighting off, the high burden areas being addressed. And so I invite you all to take a look at this on your own, because there are many, many other ways that you can slice and dice this, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some more of those as this evening goes on. So thank you so much.
It's great, huh? How hundreds of thousands of data points can be condensed into something as visually appealing and storytelling as this tool. So thank you, Avi, for showing us the GBD in pictures. Now I'd like to invite Charlie to tell us a little bit about how he and his company is working hard to make a further dent into waterborne disease burden in the world. So. We have to switch to show you the slides. There we go.
Great. So we are a private company, for profit, that was founded to tackle one little piece of this. And go to the next slide. What I want you to keep in mind for context is that there's lots of private sector and public policy and other ways of approaching this problem. There's also aid organizations that are funded typically by governments. And so although we're a private company, the context for the work that we're doing is that this affects the problem by way of the aid organizations as a market that we're selling this into. So the problem that we're working to address is that aid organizations don't have a good way, beyond just water, of finding out what's working and what's failing in the field. And so within the context of water, they're handing things out like chlorine tablets, like filters, and they don't know whether they're getting used. It turns out they're not really getting used, and they don't have the methods to address that and improve it. Go ahead to the next slide. So the product that we came up with is a low-cost water purifier that electronically records its own usage. What I have and what you see on the slide there is a prototype that we tested in Uganda about a year ago. And the way this works is a process called solar disinfection. All we're doing is exposing the water to sunlight and letting the UV kill the bacteria and viruses. So this is a 10-liter capacity. You'd fill it with water, press the start button on the little electronic widget that's sealed in there, put it out in the sun, and wait a few hours for a red blinking light to turn green. And that tells you that the water should be safe to drink. So that's how we purify water. This is reusable. It'll last for about a year, and we can offer it at a competitive price point. But the other piece here is we're offering aid organizations a way to track usage that's much better than what they had before. And that's what these organizations are getting really excited about when we talk to them. So to give you some context, the current status quo is that at best, organizations will send out people with clipboards to find out what happened in a given project. And the analogy I like to make is that the data is as good as when your dentist asks you if you've been flossing for the last 6 months. And they spend a lot of money to get this data, maybe $150 per household from surveys that we did, and they don't trust the data, and they really can't do a lot with it. So what we can offer instead is a model where every one of these purifiers is electronically recording every button press and every time it gets through a disinfection cycle. And then we have an app and a complementary piece of hardware on a smartphone that a field worker has to go around, and every time they see one of these in the field, they can press a button, they can get an instant download of how it's been used, including how it's been used since the last time they saw it, and make decisions about training people or who they should give these to based on that immediately. It also records a GPS waypoint and sends the whole thing to our computers once they're back within network connectivity. And so we can show an aid organization or project managers a map with points that say exactly how much water was purified where in the world, or where things aren't going according to plan and you need to change something about your strategy. Go ahead to the next slide. And so let's put a finer point on the impact that this can have on the cost effectiveness of aid organizations delivering water. So what you see up here is information on the effective cost of some of these other interventions that we surveyed aid organizations on compared to the price point that we expect to offer this product at. So that's part of it. But the other piece of how effective this is going to be is it really depends heavily on the usage data. And what we found out, we had to dig into academic research to find these numbers because aid organizations don't have good data, is the usage rates are terrible. They range from about 5 to 25% when you just hand stuff out to people and don't do extensive training and behavior change campaigns to get them to use it. And so if you're able to get the usage rate up, the project cost to an aid organization of getting a household actually drinking safe water, not just having been given something, is extremely good. And that's what we're able to do. That 60% uptake number actually comes from our hard data from the study that we did in Uganda a year ago. And so that's just another visualization to show you this is the real cost difference that you get when you combine the usage rates with the hardware cost of the product that you can see. I'm trying to remember what else I had. Okay, so the larger picture that we're going to with our company is to diversify our ability to collect accurate usage data from the field for aid organizations and let them make better use of resources and know when to repair a well or go talk to people about how to use a hand washing station or a latrine so that they can be more efficient about all of these things. That's our larger vision. Thanks.
Now we have Hemi, who will talk a little bit to us about his project.
Thank you all for attending tonight, and Tanja, thank you for hosting this. I'm not a water expert, and I'm flattered to be on this panel here. What I am is, like a lot of you guys, I'm an engineer, I'm a problem solver, and I've been fortunate enough to be an entrepreneur for multiple decades. So what I have is problem-solving skills coupled with, let's go get the problem solved. How did I get involved with this? Well, it's a first-world serendipitous problem. Let me see, I was coming back from a ski vacation in Colorado, and I happened to get bumped up to first class, first-world problem. We were talking about water on our ski trip. And when I got bumped up, between my two boys, there was a guy from Austin who he ran a company called CyberTrader, and he made lots of money, and he decided to donate a third of his wealth to water projects in Ethiopia. So he's talking to my two boys, and he was telling them, look, I drill wells, but the real problem is not just access to water, it's how you transport the water. And so he basically challenged us to come up with a better solution. In other words, invent a better wheel. You'll see in a minute here. But what I want to point out over here on this slide here, this is quite a telling slide. You can't see it, but this is a trail where cows and sheep and other animals will just walk through, and they'll defecate in here. This is the actual water source for this village prior to this well being drilled. Now, we're not responsible for drilling the wells, but I just want to show you some of the problems that they're encountering. And a stunning fact, the week prior to us coming there, 10 kids had died in this village of these leeches that were in their throats. They get actually caught in their throats, and they'd actually suffocate to death. I mean, it's a miserable, horrible death. The burden is by small young children, and it's simply because they're drinking water, this polluted water. You can see how they're accessing it. Anyways, water is one of the great engineering challenges. It's one of the things, access to clean water is a great engineering challenge. And knowing that this is a problem is really important, especially to all you soon-to-be graduates out there. Understanding that this is a problem and thinking about it, there's going to be innovative solutions that are going to come out of that. So water wells are drilled. They're not that expensive. It costs about $5,000 to drill a well. $5,000 will actually sustain a village of about 250 people, and the village, the life of that well is about 20 years. There is maintenance costs, but it is borne by the villagers. It's not that expensive annually. But a well will basically save 250 people. A village will basically get clean water for 20 years. And that's actually a stunning ROI number for any of you taking any business classes. That's the dollar that you will spend, the investment you get for saving someone's life is just a stunning number. And when you see these numbers, it makes it hard to ignore just what one individual can do. I mean, it doesn't take that much to say, let me donate to one of these causes. It's not that hard to make a gigantic change to people's lives, and I think we all ought to consider, if not this, some other things where you can actually make a difference in people's lives. Anyways, sidestep. Next slide, please. So it's not just water. It's not just access to water that's the problem. Another problem is that the water has to get from the wells to people's houses. And so what you see in this slide here, there's the burden falls on young children. This girl is, 8 or 9 years old. She's not that old. And this lady over here, when I was there in Ethiopia, I was stunned that someone who was 40 years old would look like a 65-year-old person over here, bent over and hunched over. I mean, they have a hard life. It's not just carrying water, but the whole thing is hard. But I challenge you guys to carry the amount of water she's carrying. She's carrying 20 kilograms of water, 45 pounds of water on her back, and she'll walk for up to about 5 kilometers, 3 miles. Possibly uphill over steep terrain without any shoes on. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to do. I would challenge you guys to even do a fraction of that. It's hard, and they have to do this every single day. So, well, what do? Well, we invented a better wheel. That's for lack of better words. Well, we didn't quite invent a better wheel yet. What we did is we sat in our first world warm, comfortable houses and said, we can solve this. We know how to solve this. And so we shipped them some commercial units. We thought we can do this, just paycheck engineering it. Well, you can't. The first units we sent failed miserably in the field. And the charity that we were associated with was very uncomfortable telling us about this failure. And it's an interesting story in itself. But this vision we had of just solving it with dollars, it failed. And it failed because we failed to realize the problems that were going on. So we had to go there and understand what was going on. Anyways, to make a long story short, we applied some business practices, some stuff that I've learned over the years of being an entrepreneur, and what I call building the minimum viable product, getting it to market, and then spinning like crazy, going through this build, measure, learn cycle. So what we did is we got our first prototype in the field, and it failed. And we learned from it. And we got another prototype in the field. And we visited it, and we saw how it was being used. And now we spun it once more. And you'll see the final next production I'm going to have in a minute here. But you can see, there's a couple of them stacked next to each other next to some jerry cans. It rolls, the other one you carry. So this one is my favorite slide. She's probably 9 years old. It became her favorite toy when we delivered it to her. She doesn't have to carry water anymore. I mean, that smile, just for me, says it all. So, well, these are expensive devices. It costs us about $30 to make, about $2 or $3 in plastics. This plastic is actually edible. You can store edible products in it. It's actually special plastic, so it does cost something. But On top of that, these things are roto-molded. And if you don't know what roto-molding is, it's a technique where heavy-duty plastic is manufactured. Think of a kayak. Well, another way to think of it is if you take a candy apple, you dip it in the hot stuff and you rotate it around like that. Well, this is the inverse of that. You put the plastic in a mold, you put it into an oven, and you let it rotate for a couple hours until the whole thing is coated. It is a labor-intensive process. It's been around since the 50s. It is extremely energy inefficient, but it does create these devices, and they're expensive. On top of that, us shipping it over there's shipping costs, and there's, of course, import duties. These became very expensive, and that's not the solution. So one of the things that we want to do, and we're going to talk about it later, is enable entrepreneurship there. And I think I might have gone beyond the slide I wanted to, but no, I do want to talk about these. So one of the things we did do is we did go to the villages to watch them being used, and we found that of the 7 or 8 different places we went to, it worked in about 50% of them. It wouldn't work in all cases. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. But remarkably enough, it did work. I mean, you can see this lady here. She's pulling a couple of wheels over from one of the wells. That lady up there is going uphill after a relatively flat distance to her house. This one is very interesting. This is the one that caused us to rethink our design. When we actually tested these in Austin, we did drop tests, we did rolling tests, we did all sorts of different tests. We failed to test it in muddy conditions in manure-infested fields. And what we found is that they get contaminated where the water comes out of. You can see the plastic cap there. That actually gets very contaminated. That's not a very good solution. So you can see that it has to be portable, and you have to carry it into people's houses, and you can see how lightweight they are there. Someone's carrying it there. Actually, that's it for now. Yes.
All right, so we got a great overview of the work that our 3 speakers are doing. And now I'd like to start with some questions. And Hemi, you're still warmed up, so first one goes to you. You've worked for and advised Fortune 500 companies. So what do you think the business sector should and can do to provide clean, affordable water to everyone? Why is this still a problem that we are talking about? Where's the real crux?
Well, I'm not a Fortune 500 company, but I can tell you that businesses have their own economic vested interests. And I personally think that if we're able to align their business interests with delivering clean water, they will naturally be pulled along into it. An example of where I think we in our water wheel are going to be relatively successful with pulling businesses into it is we've already talked to Coca-Cola. They would love to sponsor this. They'd like to have their name, Coca-Cola, plastered across all of these. So there's an example where I think if you are to engage with Fortune 500 companies and enable them to do their advertising or enable them to further their message or align it with their interests, I think they can be pulled along to do this.
Great. And Charlie, you've started a company too that provides clean, disinfected water specifically in disaster situations. Have you consulted statistics like the ones that Avi puts together through his models?
Yeah, we have. It was actually really cool to be able to use exactly the interface he just showed you, in particular the map view, to say, does it look like we're going after the places in the world or the organizations working there where there is a huge burden of in our case, diarrheal disease for kids under 5 is the real pain point that frankly appeals to donors and even governments are swayed by in funding aid organizations, and that the organizations we're working in. For our particular market, which remember isn't the overall market of people who want water, but it's the market for aid organizations spending money to provide it, other pieces that are important there are finding out where the aid money is coming from, how it's getting to the projects, and where are the projects. And that's something that is almost equally challenging to find out, and it's hard to do, and something else we're working on. And there's actually a tool that gives you a good view into that, one of the better that I've seen on the IHME website as well. Another piece that of data that I would like to see that would be very helpful is what is the purchasing power of the people that you're trying to help, and what are they spending all their money on now?
Very good. And I direct that question
We
to
should
Amy.
do that.
So I wanted to ask you too, and as a follow-up, can you cite some additional evidence where your results and your findings have translated into actual interventions and policies that countries have put in place, and perhaps have given you feedback on the results that they have achieved?
Yeah, but actually, let me first just say, that's so cool that you're actually using this. It's also a little bit disturbing knowing the level of evidence that goes into it. Like you said, the surveys that we do door to door where we're asking people, do you floss every day since the last time we've been here, unreliable, you know. We only have those in some of the countries where we're trying to fill in everything else. So, but the fact that going country by country was useful to you in such a clear way is really good to know, because that was a huge leap of faith to make country level estimates. Based on the data that was available going into the process where I landed, when I was first starting this, we said, we're just going to do 21 different regions of the world, kind of aggregations of countries into groups that we think are epidemiologically, demographically similar, because the data's not out there to do finer resolution than that. And kind of halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, 4/5 of the way through, the leader of my institute, and the guy who's the visionary behind this, said, no, you know, we should go for country by country, 188 different estimates. And there was definitely scant evidence for filling that in, but we did the best we could, and I think that the response has been really to say, we want that and more. You know, if you could go down subnationally, even below the country by country level, that's what we're really after. So a huge opportunity for basically making up numbers, the kind of math and stats stuff that I'm doing, but also huge opportunity for getting new data in to kind of inform these estimates. You asked about where people have used it besides Charlie, and one of the most exciting stories that I've heard recently comes from this Rue Prize winner of 2015, which is the Minister of Health of Rwanda, used the results of the 2010 Global Burden of Disease study to say, I'm really surprised to see what the burden of indoor air pollution is. This isn't a water story, so I'll try to mix it in. But, you know, water and food and cooking, it's all very much related to these basic human needs that have to go on, regardless of how, you know, accessible the kind of first world conveniences that we're used to are for doing it. And so in a lot of parts of the world, the way food is cooked is by burning solid fuel, and in a lot of parts of the world, that fuel is burned in the house. And if there's not good ventilation, this is generating a lot of carbon monoxide and other things that, especially over a long term, can be really bad for health. So the Minister of Health saw how surprising this was, and she started a program to really distribute clean cook stoves, and they have gotten a huge number of cook stoves out there kind of based on this evidence, saying, okay, here's something that we know is a problem, that we know we can do about it. Let's do it.
Great. I'm sure you'll get more of these as you make the models ever more higher resolution at national and even subnational levels.
And I should mention there is this annual prize for it now. So if you know someone who's doing it, you should nominate them for it. It's called the Rue Prize, and it has cash attached to it. It's like good.
It's a good prize, huh?
Prize. Good prize to win.
So the World Bank has cited that public-private partnerships, PPPs, meaning collaborations between the public sector and the business sector, are a vital part of finding innovative solutions to water issues, but also a host of other health-related issues. Hemi and Charlie, as members of the business community, what do you think? Do you agree, or is adaptation to this public-private partnership model necessary in the water sector?
Slides for this?
So I showed the slide a little too early. I meant to wait until here, but I want to show those other pictures, so he got a preview of the slide. I think there has to be adaptation, personally. A perfect example of this is this water wheel costs us about $30 to make, and we could probably shave $12 of that if we were to make it locally in Africa, which I think is quite capable of doing. Rotomold is 50s technology. We can easily adapt it over there. But even if we did bring it down in cost, the problem is that what somebody's willing to bear in paying for one of these is about 85 birr in Ethiopia, which is about $4, or about 1 week's worth of labor. So let's go through some simple math here. We're still a fair ways off in terms of production of this device and what somebody's willing to bear. And I'm an entrepreneur, and I believe that one way to get these, Charlie was asking me earlier what my channels to market are for this. So when you're solving, running your company, one of the biggest problems you're going to be facing is how do you get your products to market? And getting your products to market is exceedingly difficult. It's actually sometimes more difficult than solving the engineering problem itself. Well, frankly, I don't know how to solve the problem other than I'd love to enable an entrepreneur to, in Ethiopia or whatever country we go to solve those problems. And I think we can do it because I think a push model is better than a pull model. Rather, a pull model is better than a push model where these things are pulled from us instead of us pushing the models into them. What that means is we're going to have to find a way to subsidize the delta between what we have to sell it to an entrepreneur for and how much he's going to sell to the final consumer for. The final cost is only going to be $4. Remember, it's costing me $30 to make this. So there's a little bit of a gap there. And I alluded to this before. There's ways to solve it. I mean, Coca-Cola, they've talked to us already. They would love to partner with us on this. They'd love to see their name being rolled all through the countryside. That would be fantastic for them. So I do agree. I think there's ways to rethink it and find creative ways of funding that gap.
Charlie, what do you think?
Sure. So when I was thinking about this question, I like to look for examples where we've seen a similar problem solved before. And what comes to mind immediately is the idea of utilities of something that is so important and basic that as a matter of public policy, we've put regulations and incentives in place to make sure that everybody gets it. And so that also means that there are private players involved, but they operate within a confined context. So governments are in a position to decide to invest in infrastructure and decide to set policies that create a context in which private entities can develop specific niche expertises and deliver products that aren't a great role for the government. So, in some of these contexts, and this is why there's a market for an aid product, which is what we're going after, the government is just not there. They don't have the resources, and they're probably quite corrupt. They're just not taking care of people, and so there's an emergency response that is needed to help people there. But I think in the longer term, you do want to see governments investing in making sure that these things are met, and you do want private players to be able to actually implement the solutions that are chosen.
Great, and I have a follow-up question for you that I'm very curious about, and I think that maybe many of our students would also like to learn more about because they're thinking about careers in engineering, in computer science, and so forth, and want to leave or make an impact on the world. So in the startup world, how does this work? You're producing a product that addresses a public need, but at the same time, you want to create a sustainable business model for your company, and you have intellectual property to protect. So what kind of challenges do you face in this environment, and how has PotaVida, for example, managed to navigate them?
Sure. So I'll back up even a little bit of a step further, which is we initially expected to be a nonprofit entity. And when we looked at where we could go that way versus where we could go as a for-profit, we saw a much bigger opportunity to scale the distribution of our product as a for-profit, where it was supported by a market. And we went through what's referred to as a pivot, a big shift in how we expected to run our business and generate revenue and make everything work, from something that we hope to sell to end users. And as we talked about, distribution is a huge problem. Another huge problem is being able to manufacture something that people are willing to pay that price for is incredibly difficult. especially if you're manufacturing something in the U.S. and then shipping it to less developed countries, and customs is a huge problem there as well. And so we shifted to, we're instead going to go after this aid market in order to meet the need. Can you remind me? I'm sorry, I forgot.
I was just wondering how you navigated sort of protecting also your intellectual property,
Sure.
right? You have a design component in there that maybe once you put it in the field can be stolen, perhaps. So,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, that's an interesting piece, and a complement to that intellectual property issue. And we do have a patent, is how we're doing that. It's a U.S. patent, and we've also filed the PCT so we can prosecute the patent elsewhere. But we don't have a strong expectation of being able to defend the patent in countries where people might want to try to steal this idea and run with it. So it's going to be, for us, it's going to be first to market and then maintaining customer loyalty, because we're going to offer data analysis services that span not just our initial product, but others that I think will make us a compelling reason to continue buying from us and not simply go for whatever is the cheapest possible option. Now, in the world of thinking about how you can use engineering design to solve problems in less developed countries, there is a temptation to say, let's make this design open source so that anybody can use it. And a pitfall with that is, if anybody can make it, nobody can necessarily have a defensible competitive business model to continue making it. You can compete all of the profit away, and there's not a good incentive for people to keep doing that. And so it can actually stifle the propagation of a great design, and that's why we have a patent system. And so I think that defensible intellectual property is a critical part of private sector solutions to these problems.
Thank you. So, as you know, the climate change negotiations are currently going on in Paris. And Bill Gates, who has, through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, been a longtime supporter of public health research and investment in statistics and models and innovative programs in many countries around the world, has announced the launch of a multi-billion-dollar effort fund for clean energy development. So I don't want to pass on this opportunity to ask all of you, what do you think? Where should the philanthropic efforts in the water health development nexus, where are they going? Do we need more of those big commitments to tackle the water access and affordability issue, or what do you see happening?
I haven't talked for a while, but this is far outside my area of expertise. So what I want to say, partially based on the public-private partnerships that we were just talking about, is a word of caution. And in the global burden of disease map that I showed you, I had focused on the risk factor of unsafe water. But just in a different part of that drop-down, I could have looked at obesity. I could have looked at sugar-sweetened beverages as a particular risk factor causing some of the diseases up there. And there are conflicting incentives here. And Coca-Cola, while it's great, if they want to help the world get clean water, is also very entrenched in some of the risk factors causing some of the other diseases in that list. So we must proceed with caution. And I feel the same way about these billionaire philanthropists. It is so wonderful that Bill Gates is devoting his fortune to improving problems in the world and lining up fellow extremely rich people to work with him on it, like he's doing with this climate initiative. On the other hand, it doesn't have any of the accountability of a public sector solution. And I think that the risk we run is Bill Gates, or maybe someone who hasn't been in it for as long as him, waking up tomorrow and saying, what was I doing wasting my fortune on clean energy when I could have been trying to terraform Mars, or whatever it is that they wake up thinking they want to do. So a word of caution.
Who again provides your funding, Avi?
It is important to have a diverse funding stream, but many thanks to the Gates Foundation for the support they have given us so far.
That was a healthy dose of cynicism there, I think. So I don't have to add to that. Thank you for putting that out there. What I'll add to the conversation, I think, is that it's wonderful to see people with those priorities and being very public about them and asking other people to participate in thinking about it and in contributing to it. There's a number of reasons why having money is not the same as having the right perspective or expertise to solve the problems, but I think on balance it's great to see the attention and to see something happening. And in comparison to spending that money to win the America's Cup or something, it's on balance doing a lot of good for the world, so I'm happy to see it.
Hello? Hello? Nope. Just watch for a second. Hi. Is that better? Yes. Well, first of all, I appreciate your comment on Coca-Cola. At the same time, they are a source of revenue.
No disrespect to anyone who wants to fund my work from a Coca-Cola or Terraforming Mars background.
As far as your question, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've had certain experiences that jade my answers, so I apologize if, well, they're my answers. But I honestly think that throwing money at a problem, it can be counterproductive. I think what's more important is to go visit your customers, and in this case, your customers are going to be the people you're servicing. So I think enabling small companies to fund them to go visit the customers and solve these problems will be more productive than simply throwing lots of dollars at a solution and sitting here and trying to solve it.
And how? No, mine is dying. Thank you. So how could academia and business work together effectively to tackle some of the issues in the water sector? Have you had collaborations? And if so, what were some of the lessons learned? What worked? What didn't work? If you have not had collaborations between sort of academic science and entrepreneurial business development, what would your ideal partnership look like?
I think that the role of academia is really the production of the knowledge, and the translation is something that we can't do very well. I, based on my last comment, don't want to say unequivocally it should be turned over to the private sector to be done. It depends on what it is, but it's something that with my professorial hat and elbow patches on, I'm not in the best position to carry out. That said, we're very good at identifying gaps in our knowledge and to some degree trying to fill in those gaps. And an example that comes to mind is a recent great move by the Gates Foundation to identify a gap in knowledge and then fund some different researchers to look into it, which is, I showed on that map before that unsafe water is a big risk factor leading to diarrhea, which is potty humor, giggle-inducing story in some cases, but very serious disease in others, but really a collection of different diseases, or there are a bunch of different etiologies or agents that are causing this illness. And Gates Foundation said there's a real lack in knowledge about which of these are more important and where. And this is an area that a recent study has put some new evidence into, saying, well, actually it turns out rotavirus is a major causative agent in a lot of the disease that we're seeing in Africa and South Asia. And surprise, something called cryptosporidium turns out also to be a major causative agent. And rotavirus, there's a vaccine for. It's been a little bit controversial, but it's now something that we can say, well, it seems like something that not academics, but whoever is doing projects can try to roll this out in certain places. Crypto, maybe there's room for new innovation, maybe new knowledge about what we can do to kind of get out ahead.
So I'll talk a little bit about how we've developed our product, because I think it's an example of good synergy there. So I have this plastic bag made of a special material that lets the UV through, and we measure up to a cumulative UV exposure threshold, and then we say that the water is safe to drink. How do we know that? Well, we're leaning on more than 20 years of academic research that has gotten millions of dollars of funding into it for academics all over the world to study all the processes that kill lots of different pathogens, including things like cryptosporidium, so that we can sit down and when someone says, how do you know that this works, I can just push a stack of papers at them if they want to really dig into it. And moreover, when we're doing our own testing and product development, we can only test with E. coli, which is something you can buy on the internet and isn't going to kill you if you drink it. It'll make you sick, though. And know that our product is going to work on all these other pathogens because it's been tested. We can really lean on the academic literature there. And then moving forward, once we roll the product out, we're going to be able to invest resources in fairly straightforward, simplistic analyses to show our customers, here's what you should be doing differently or could be doing differently to get more results out of it. But I would love to hand off a data set to IHME to put an academic level of effort into analyzing that data more deeply to find out what else we can learn from it, and then turn around and put that into practice.
Hello? Yeah. So it's interesting. I was talking to Dr. Little up there earlier today about a topic he's obviously very involved with, clinic. And we're talking about global clinic. And to answer your question, I think problems that when we go to these countries and we see, I think it'd be a fairly natural fit for a global clinic to get involved with academia, especially to give a lot of bright young people here from diverse set of backgrounds. Here's the problem: how can you solve this? So having multiple eyes on this, especially from academia and the energy from that, I think it would be a really good collaboration. And I'm actually quite excited about what we can come out of these kind of partnerships. So to answer your question succinctly, I think there's lots of possibilities here.
Let's see. Yeah, works. I'd like to switch to California now for a moment. We have an ongoing exceptional drought in the state, actually, in large parts of the western United States. And that drought has already led to a few hundred wells running dry due to increased groundwater pumping. And therefore, several thousand people are already impacted by water shortages that we perhaps otherwise would not have expected to see in a country like the United States. So, A.B., perhaps that's a question for you. What do we know then, using statistics and modeling? How many people are impacted? How many are at risk? Where do they live? And what health consequences might they be facing?
This is a tough question, Tanja. So I'm glad you gave me a little bit of lead time, and I knew that something like this might be coming. Now, I have a map kind of like the global map that I showed you, which goes county by county in the United States. And it's not filled in with all the detail that we've got in that global map. It's mostly just about the things that kill. So I asked the group that I've been working with, if Tanja asked me this, what should I say? And they said, okay, it's not going to be diarrhea. We are still in the United States, and we still have piped water, and we still have a functioning health system. We're not going to see a change over to sub-Saharan Africa, South Asian kind of lack of access to clean water. What it's going to be, this is a geography grad student who's saying it in her top of her field, but also kind of just off the cuff thing. So we're going to see a lot of changes in farming practices, and we're going to see a lot of depressed farmers, and we're going to have to look out for intentional injuries, is what we call it, suicides and attempted suicides, based on the financial implications of the difficulties in farming from doing all of this. We're also going to see a lot more extreme climate events. This is all related, right? And so we're going to have to worry about the kinds of things that happen related to that, such as air pollution, such as maybe there'll be changes in fires, in traffic patterns. So the way this may play out in the United States is going to be very different than what we see globally. But we should expect something to be happening.
And when you go to clean tech exhibits now here in the United States and in LA, for example, the water sector is always represented, it seems. And I was wondering, Hemi and Charlie, if you're following domestic innovative developments as well. What are some of the cool ideas that are emerging here to secure our water supply? And is there a cross-fertilization possible between sort of resource-scarce settings and remote regions and what we see here in terms of innovative ideas to protect our domestic water supply?
I'll share a quick and kind of limited perspective. So in our own interest, we pay attention to these kind of events when it looks like, frankly, we can enter competitions and get attention from investors or even win prize money. One of them that I've paid attention to that is based, I think, in the Bay Area is Imagine H2O, which I'd recommend you look up if you're interested in startup companies that are doing things in the water space. And what they've really been focusing on is collecting much more detailed data about how water is used. Not only simple things that are trying to change people's behavior at home, but industrial, agricultural use of water. Even doing new forms of aerial photography to find out what's going on and be much, much more efficient about how water is used. As far as what we're doing, having cross-pollination, it's difficult because we have great infrastructure and pipe water systems here, and the problems that we're trying to address are explicitly the problems that you have when that doesn't exist and is not immediately feasible to put in.
So I'm aware of some technological stuff that's going on different campuses. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and there's some professors I keep in touch with there. And so they've actually created these ceramic filters which are actually capable of filtering out viruses. It's new materials. They're using new materials to filter out smaller particles. So am I aware of innovation going on in clean tech? No, but I'm aware of little things like that. It's actually kind of cool where cross-department pollination can happen, where someone in material and applied science can be solving problems and not even aware of it.
Okay, I have two more questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. One is a short one, the other is a little bit longer, but they all go to all of you. So it seems that when it comes to water, we can either see the glass is half full or half empty. So I want to ask each of one of you, what's your perspective? Which group do you fall into? And then in conclusion, as I mentioned, we have many students in the audience who would like to use their skills and knowledge to make a positive impact on society and the environment. Would you like to share some advice based on your experiences and your careers and pathways so far?
They're looking at me. Should I start again?
You're going to go first.
All right. Wonderful. So half full or half empty, do I really have to pick? Because I think both. But if you're really going to make me pick, I'd say I'm optimistic here. And the reason is the changes over time that I was showing you in that figure. If you look at the burden of diarrhea and how it has changed over time, and we don't even have to get into the complicated units that we're using. Just in 1990, we were talking about 1.5 million deaths among children under 5, basically because of unsafe water. And that has fallen to just around 500,000 in 2013. So huge improvement over the last 20, 25 years. And that's reason to be optimistic, right? So I think we should be glass, which one's optimistic? Full, glass half full. On the other hand, the bulk of that progress in terms of reducing the mortality has not been mirrored in reducing the morbidity. There are still a lot of people getting sick. We've basically improved critical care, and they're not dying from the illness. May also be a shift in the kinds of sickness they're getting. But that could make you pessimistic and say, we've been doing the stuff that's easier and it's going to be harder going in the future. It could make you optimistic because what the focus has been on is on the really critical care stuff that's going to prevent people who are sick from dying. If we now start to focus on the stuff like having good water to start with, that is a real opportunity to say now we're going to be able to shift in the next 20, 25 years on the morbidity side of things. Should I do the other part too? No, let's let everyone else do some.
So I take a glass half full perspective, and for me, I don't have all that data behind my perspective, but what I do have is this intuition and observation as an engineer that we don't need fundamentally new technologies to solve these problems. We really need cross-disciplinary work to apply the right existing technologies to solve these problems. And a lot of it even comes down to the right institutions and business models to execute on it. So I think there are tremendous opportunities to solve these problems and create value with private sector solutions in doing so.
So a glass half full. I'm an entrepreneur. By definition, I got to see things glass half full. I have to be optimistic. But having said that, I do believe that, especially here in the U.S., we have a culture of approaching problems head on. When we recognize the problem, when we see it, and we embrace the problem, we find a way to solve it. So I do believe it's half full, and we're going to solve these problems.
I like that. We're a bunch of optimists here. That's good. Now, perhaps one piece of advice from or shared experience. Let's put it this way from each one of you for our students.
May I go first?
Yes.
So I end up giving a lot of talks at various business schools, and I often get lots of questions on advice and things. So I want to talk about a few things here, not necessarily just about water, but also, I mean, a lot of you guys are going to be graduating shortly, and so there's some things that I do want to share with you guys as you graduate. The first is, if you want to do something, just go do it. Seriously. Use the Nike slogan and just do it. If you want to do it, just go start and do it. And coupled with that is what you're taught in school as you're sitting here. You're taught not to fail. You're taught that you have to be very successful. You're taught that you have to have perfect scores. You're taught that you can't get the wrong answer. Well, in reality, you're going to learn more from failing than you are from getting the right answer. So don't be afraid to fail. Go out there and make a bunch of failures. You're going to learn from it. And let me see. I view failure as a learning experience. Find your passion in life. When you're passionate, things are going to be very easy. So if I have to leave you with one message here tonight, is not just about water, but go find what you really, truly care about and do it.
I'll definitely second and try not to be redundant on the just get out there and execute on it. A nuance that I put on it for thinking about solutions for developing countries is you have to travel and get out there and see how people live, find out what the assumptions were you came in with, and destroy them and start over and understand what it is that people want and not what you think that they need. And then, get involved, get something out there, try it, fail, try again. As you're looking at an institution that you might want to work with, or if you're developing a product, trying something new, be brutally honest about whether the solution or the institution that you're a part of is something that has real impact, that is really scalable. I think there's a tendency for organizations to think that the intention and the hopeful social benefit is going to carry something through. And what I would say instead is look at the math to tell you whether you're going to have impact and whether it's a scalable solution. And that means one way or another you have to be able to sell something to someone for more than it costs to make it, for example.
I like all of that so much, and I don't want to just repeat it, but I think to add to it, or attempt to add to it, I want to also really call attention to who. And this relates a lot to what Charlie is saying about getting out there and seeing who it is. If you're trying to do aid, who are you trying to help? But if you're trying to do business, there's a real question of who is your customer. And there's a lot of different ideas about this, but I think that, if you have a very business approach to this, you might say your customer is someone who is paying you. And if you're trying to do aid, then the person you're trying to help might not be the person that you pay the most attention to from a business perspective. there's a real risk here. And so we have been such optimists and so positive. I don't want to end on a negative note about this. Let me try to turn it into something positive, that by having a more holistic and more comprehensive view of the different actors who are involved and the different interests that they have, there's a lot of benefit that can come from this.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now give the audience an opportunity to ask their own questions. So, do we have questions?
I have a question. Who are these people that are the biggest at risk? Are they the farm workers, the field workers, people taking care of the cattle? Because it seems like you know, the man that runs the household doesn't really care too much, or doesn't know how to care for his own family, to put kids to do that kind of labor and drink that kind of water. Are they like stuck in their jobs and they can't go anywhere else? They have to stay at such a miserable place with no water? And how do they fight that?
I guess that question is addressed to me. Well, in a lot of these villages we visited, they're very remote, very isolated. There is no other place for them to go to. And however, you said the burden of transporting the water, obtaining the water and food falls on women and children. And there is a significant disparity. The burden falls. A lot of men just won't do this work. And they can't. There's nowhere for them to move to. They're the subsistence farmers. This is their land. There's nowhere for them to go.
What I'll add to that, my personal experience traveling was doing this field test, and that was in mostly in refugee settlements in Uganda. And so people were also subsistence farmers there. And everything is correct about the disparity of the division of labor. The other thing I've added as far as the risk factor is that a lot of people were drinking water that wasn't safe all the time. It might have even been safe coming from a well, but they didn't have soap to wash their hands, and it was contaminated. And I tested it. By the time they drank it, it was contaminated. So everybody is in a state of their immune system being challenged all the time. And what that means is that even adults, it was not uncommon for people to get sick with something and be dead 2 days later because their immune system was already so challenged and compromised. So the risk really falls on children, and this is why you have a specific category in the study, which is children under 5 and what's affecting them. And when they get diarrhea and they get dehydrated, it's life-threatening every time. And so that's where the huge risk falls.
Just to tack on one thing beyond that, a lot of people do go. And over that whole time period that I was showing the change in the burden of disease, there's also been a change in rural and urban composition of the world. Huge migrations underway of people saying, you know what, it's not livable here. We got to go to the city. And there's this growth of these mega cities, really, all around the world, which are gigantic aggregations of human beings in one place. Whole different problem besides what we have been talking about primarily today.
Hi, thanks so much for coming and talking to us. My question was kind of talked about earlier when you were asked about what sort of domestic technologies are cutting edge kind of. I wanted to know more specifically, what are the research fields that have been instrumental in your inspiration for coming up with your technologies? If you know any.
Well, again, I'm not a water expert, and I don't even claim to be one. For me, I'm a bootstrap, get it done kind of guy. So I see a problem, we tackle it. You look around for solutions. The stuff that we're working with, these plastic, is not innovative. This rotomold technology has been around since the 50s. It's very old. There's nothing new in creating these designs and transporting them. So unfortunately, I don't see myself as using some of that to solve it. Not only that, I need to quantify that with when we sit here and try to think of new and innovative ways. I agree with what these gentlemen have been saying. You need to go visit the customers. I don't necessarily think new and innovative technologies by itself can solve these problems. Sometimes old tech and frugal engineering can solve them. However, what you should do is, if you're interested, take some of these technologies and see how they can apply by visiting the problems.
Yeah, so for our technology, I kind of mentioned the academic background that we were able to leverage. And there are a few, significant papers that are as recent as the last 5 years that were very helpful to us. But the problem that we were looking at was not what's the next step with the research here. It was, it looks like the research has been done, but no one is using this process. And for context, the reason that the research was done in the intended use case was you can save disposable water bottles like you'd buy from a vending machine, just PET bottles. Those will work to purify water. You just have to leave them in the sun for long enough. Well, how long? You don't know. And so imagine trying to teach people, just fill these used bottles with water, put them on your roof for about a day, and you're good, and you'll never know whether you're doing it right. And then, of course, it turns out that those bottles aren't laying around free in the streets everywhere. They only turn out to be around tourist hotels. So all these problems are not a question of fundamental research. They're a question of how do you translate the research into a scalable solution for lots and lots of people.
Yeah, I have another question. Your type of institutions are saying we're going to have 2 billion more people by 2050. So that ought to move up the bar quite high. Have you looked into that? What's going to happen in the next 30 years or so as far as all these type of problems?
We're working on it. And this is something that has been one of the biggest asks when we make these estimates going up to 2010, and they say, come on, we need to know what happens by 2013. Okay, we need to know what happens by 2015, but actually let's get out ahead. What's going to happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now? And this predicting the future stuff, man, if you think the evidence base I have for making all the estimates that were in that chart are flimsy, how are we going to say what's going to happen coming down the line? So we're going for it, but I think that there's some real risks to communicating this like we know what's going to happen. There are so many variables in play. The only thing we're going to be able to say is, here's a scenario, here's what might happen. Here's a different scenario, here's how things could go differently.
So I'll add to that. I'm going to parrot an academic researcher who really focuses on exactly that problem. His name is Hans Rosling. He has a couple of pretty cool TED Talks. He has a website called gapbinder.org. And what I recall from one of those recent talks is that right now, if you look at people's income, for example, there's a bimodal distribution that is changing over time. So you have the bottom billion, and then you have an upper class, and there's a valley in between. And over time, that's actually going to collapse into a single distribution, and that's going to be a major shift in the way things work as a consequence.
Other questions? Okay. Maybe we'll take these last two questions.
Yeah, my question's for Charlie, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your background in founding your company and what it was like to come from an engineering background and enter the business environment that you have, and how your particular background was advantageous or a challenge with your relative lack of experience in the business world, presumably.
Sure. Yeah, so the quick answer is that business is not hard. It's way easier than engineering. But you do have to really pay attention, and you have to look in a new way to understand the underlying models and mechanisms that are at work in how businesses work and in how they fail. So I was in grad school, and I was finishing dissertation work on brain-computer interfaces, obviously not related to this in the least. When the design competition came up that caused a team to come together that I was part of, and we jumped on this problem, and then it ended up turning into the company. I had had an interest in entrepreneurship for a long time, so I'd actually taken half a dozen business classes on the side while I was doing my PhD, and I recommend that if you have any interest in business. One of my selling points will be that it's going to be an easy A while you're in grad school. And as far as the skill set, you know, from engineering, it's been honestly going all the way back to classes like E4, just thinking about let's be really disciplined about exactly what we're trying to achieve here, exactly what our options are to do it, and build exactly what is needed and nothing more is the really important part with my product. And my specific skill set, you know, I did electrical engineering for my grad program. I design circuits and I write embedded code, but I probably could have hired someone else to do that as well. So it's certainly leveraging my background, but at a very high level of structured thinking about engineering problems.
I was wondering, and from your perspective, how much of a problem are regulatory constraints? For instance, here in California, we reclaim a lot of water, but we can't drink it because of the regulations, but it's perfectly drinkable.
I'm from Texas. I don't care about regulations.
I think in a lot of the global settings that we were talking about, it really cuts the other way, that if there was more of a public sector involvement in this sort of basic service delivery, then we could actually be in much better shape. So the pendulum swings. You know, it definitely depends on context and can go too far in many directions.
Yeah, to the problem of the reclaimed water, I heard that there's you put a pond in the middle of that whole pipeline and let the water be outdoors and then grab it again, but people get upset about that. I would second this idea of we actually need more, I don't know if you'd call it regulation, but just government oversight in developing countries. I can, again, only speak from my experience in Uganda. No one trusted the tap water in the capital of the country. Everybody would boil it. I tested it myself because I brought the tools, and it was clean, at least of E. coli. I still didn't drink it because you don't know how consistently it's clean. So that's one area where the government needs to be doing a better job. There was also bottled water for sale all over the place, and you would hear about plants that were just bottling water maybe even out of a river, right? So you think of bottled water as the safe fallback if you want to know that your water is safe. It's a whole different issue that in the U.S. is not held to the same standards as tap water. But in developing countries, people can't trust water vendors who are selling them water with the markup being explicitly because it should be clean. And so that's a huge problem where the lack of regulation is preventing the private sector from doing what it should do, which is solve that problem in a way that, because there's no trust.
Did you get the same travel advice that I got for what to drink when you're in low-income country?
I don't know. Was it beer?
Beer or Coke?
Yep, that's a very good note to end on. Let's thank our panelists, folks. And thank you all for coming. If you go out to the lobby, we've got some dessert out there, and I'm sure the panelists would be interested in talking some more to you. Thank you.